At Wire, we often get a lot of calls around the end of financial year about people who are experiencing different forms of financial abuse. Something that we've been hearing a lot of lately is that this financial abuse is happening through small business and tax debt. So we're joined here today with Kirsty from the Consumer Action Law Centre, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about financial abuse, tax debt, and what you can do to keep yourself safe and if you do need help. Hi Kirsty, thanks for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Consumer Action Law Centre?
Sure. My name's Kirsty Robson. I'm the Managing Financial Counsellor at Consumer Action Law Centre, and we run the National Debt Helpline for Victoria. We also have a financial counselling chat service for Victoria and Queensland.
Oh, nice. And what issues might someone reach out for support?
Well, at the moment, mortgages are a top presenting issue, followed very closely by tax debts. People reach out for support with utilities, so electricity, gas, water and telco bills, and credit cards, personal loans, unsecured debts.
Yeah, I think we hear a lot of that here at Wire as well. And something that you just mentioned was the tax debts. So we get a lot of callers, especially around this time of year, that reach out to us because they have been experiencing what they don't realise is family violence or financial abuse, but it's coming through with those tax debts that they didn't know that they had, or through small businesses. Is that something that you hear a lot about as well?
Absolutely. So the tax system is often weaponised by perpetrators to incur debts in victim survivors' names, debts that they might not know about or debts that they were coerced into. And tax debts are not easy things to deal with. We're often looking at the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the system is not easy for victim survivors to navigate.
And how do you respond to those sort of issues that you're hearing?
Each financial abuse tax debt is complex. It depends on whether or not it was set up with a directorship or a straw directorship, which means, director in name only, or coerced directorships where they were forced into it. Or whether it's, as simple as a perpetrator incurring a debt by submitting a victim survivor's tax returns and claiming refunds on things that they couldn't substantiate when they were audited. So it really depends on the circumstances of each case.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. We actually hear a lot of that side, but we also hear the other side where people or perpetrators are refusing to do tax as like a bit of a threat to the victim survivor, so sort of knowing that debt is accumulating and what impact that might have if that person were to leave too. So very interesting how the system can be weaponised.
Absolutely, and very integrated with how other government systems like Centrelink and child support are also weaponised, which can often lead to people being underpaid, their child support, or incurring Centrelink debts in their names as well. Yeah, it's a long road.
The fraudulent directorships that you mentioned before, what's the impact of those on taxpayers?
So I think the most common way that victim survivors will find out about these directorships is when they receive a director's penalty notice from the tax office. So a director's penalty notice is a penalty incurred when directors don't meet their obligations. What that means is, if tax hasn't been paid in the company, then a director will be held personally liable with a director's penalty notice. And these are significant. I've seen director's penalty notices that are always upwards of $50,000. And you have 21 days to respond when you receive the notice. When you're a victim survivor with no access to documents that are pertaining to this debt or access into the company, or, at its core, it's a safety risk. Contacting the tax office is a huge barrier. It's a massive burden that 21 days often passes, and then their options become incredibly limited.
Yeah. And what options do exist for someone if they were to realise that they had been listed as a director without their knowledge?
I think, the best option would be being able to prove that this debt doesn't belong to you, and being able to, allocate it to the person who it does belong to. But that requires contacting ASIC and proving that you were never a director. You have to make sure that, you're talking to people about whether or not they've committed any acts as directors. So have they sent any emails? Have they participated as a director during that period of time? And then they've got to prove to ASIC that they weren't a director and be removed from the registry. And then they have to take that to the tax office. And then the tax office will remove the director's penalty notice.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Quite a few steps.
A number of steps, and nothing I would recommend doing without getting, additional advice, because it's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of pressure. It doesn't happen overnight.
And what challenges do victim survivors face when they're trying to prove that these debts are not actually theirs?
I think the most common problem victim survivors face is that they don't have the records that they need to prove that the debts aren't theirs. I mean, it's part and parcel with not incurring the debt in the first place, is that you don't have the evidence that you need to prove to the tax office that it wasn't you. It's also really difficult to prove financial abuse. When you're in a relationship with someone and that kind of coercive control has taken over, there aren't documents. There's no way of being like, here's control over my credit card, or I don't have access to my income. Like, these things aren't documented for good reason. That's exactly how they're perpetrated. So it's really hard to prove, and perpetrators aren't forthcoming with the information that victim survivors need. And the tax office doesn't have systems in place that adequately protect victim survivors from this happening in the first place, but they also don't have systems in place yet that respond appropriately when it's disclosed.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard that on the phones as well with Wire. Like, some systems sort of say, well, you need evidence, or you need to take photos of the documents, or whatnot. But that's not always safe for people that are within that family violence situation. So it's really, I can appreciate that would be a really big concern for
it
people.
Is, absolutely. And it's not just for victim survivors. Even advocates are having trouble navigating these systems.
Yeah. What role does the National Debt Helpline and the financial counsellors that work there play in supporting these affected individuals?
The National Debt Helpline gets a lot of referrals through from the tax office directly, but also people find us online and give us a call. I think one of the most important first steps for me is talking to people about being in a wider system, and that this is a systemic issue. And nothing that they've done wrong. And just making sure that they're kind of grounded in that this experience and this process, which is not going to get resolved overnight, isn't their fault, and that it is just about taking each step as it comes. And the tax office are very process driven, and they expect you to take the next step, and we can talk you through what that might be.
Yeah, I think with all forms of family violence, what we hear at Wire is that shame and embarrassment that comes along with it, like people blaming themselves, as you mentioned. So I think it is a really big part, just letting them know that they weren't to know, and it's of no fault of their own. So it's really nice that you're sort of communicating that message as well.
I think as well with victim survivors who have been coerced into these debts and knew what was happening, but were powerless to stop anything. It's actually there's a strength there in choosing safety and surviving over incurring this tax debt. And in the end, it is just a tax debt, and it's not more important than your life. And we can deal with it after the fact.
Yeah, that's really, really nice to remember. And how can tax clinics assist individuals who are dealing with these issues?
So tax clinics are all over Australia. It's a fantastic program that's set up in universities, and so it's run by law students, but they are supervised. And they support people to get their taxes up to date, advocate with the tax office on certain issues, investigating what's happening, disputing debts, things like that. So it's a great place to get some free legal advice and to get that additional support. I think especially when you're really at a loss, your tax returns aren't up to date, it could have been many, many years. Being able to sit down with someone and get it all sorted so that you know what you're dealing with is a really important first step with the tax office.
Yeah. And those tax clinics, can they deal with the sort of the larger scale issues like the coerced directorship or the debts and stuff as well, not
Yeah.
just tax returns and the smaller stuff? Yep.
Absolutely. Family balance is a priority.
How does the ATO approach debt compromises, and why is it challenging to negotiate reduced settlements?
So the tax office has a handful of options available when you incur a debt with them as a taxpayer. One of them is a release application, so you can ask to be released from only a certain number of debts. It's certainly not business-related tax debts like GST, pay-as-you-go, or super guarantees, which means that a lot of financial abuse tax debts can't be released, but personal income tax potentially could be. Release applications are incredibly difficult. You have to show that you would be substantially better off if they released. And they'll look at things like if your income and expenses are in a deficit, they won't release you from a tax debt. If you have other debts, they won't release you from a tax debt. So it is really difficult to meet those expectations. Another option is a compromise of a tax debt. And so this is when you could offer full and final, so less amount than what's owing. And that process is quite arduous. The document itself is 52 pages long. The tax office also, in the application for a compromise of a tax debt, it says this is an act of bankruptcy. So, that's quite frightening for people who are looking at that. I also think that compromises aren't necessarily a very good option for victim survivors because you're compromising an amount owing that they didn't necessarily incur, and in my opinion shouldn't have to pay back in the first place. Yeah, so that's always a tough one. With financial abuse tax debts, the tax office their practice law statements say that if the debt is incurred by fraud by a known party, then it's not the tax office's issue, that it should be dealt with in the civil court. And so obviously financial abuse is incurred by people known to the victim survivors, and the tax office is of the opinion that would be better resolved in, say, a family law property settlement, which, is another barrier for victim survivors because it's expensive, it takes years and years and years, and in the meantime, tax debts are accruing interest and the tax office is threatening enforcement. So that's not a perfect option in any respect.
No, definitely not. And you mentioned bankruptcy there. We often get quite a lot of questions about bankruptcy, and I think it's often been sold as a really easy option for some people. But when might involuntary bankruptcy become a risk for someone or an affected individual?
So with tax debts, with any debt, you'd get plenty of warning generally before you were made bankrupt. It's quite a process. There needs to be a judgment, and then they'd need to be served with a bankruptcy notice. The bankruptcy notice would need to expire, and then somebody was committing an act of bankruptcy before a creditor's petition could be served in the federal court. To what you said before, sometimes it is the best option. Yep, absolutely. With debts that are extremely significant, when there's no assets at risk, when an income's underneath the threshold, then it's certainly, going to be the pathway of least resistance. For victim survivors, it's deeply unjust, I think, to have to bankrupt for debts that they didn't incur. But when the system doesn't have options to protect victim survivors, and that the fight is going to be so hard, sometimes when debts are that significant, people might choose to go down that way. But that's not something I'd recommend without having a chat to the National Debt Helpline, without having a chat to the tax clinics, and making sure that you're making an informed choice.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of weighing up that needs to happen before that's a choice. Yeah,
and definitely worth always making a complaint about the tax office to the tax office and to the tax ombudsman before you consider it, because if this is what's happening, then people need to know about it.
Yeah. For sure. And what provisions have been made within the ATO to support victim survivors of financial abuse? You've sort of touched on this, but do you think it's important to disclose family violence in the ATO? Is there benefits with that?
Yes, I absolutely think you should disclose the family violence to the tax office. and seek a referral through to their specialised client support team in order to get the best possible care. While options are limited, they can still make sure that you have time that you need to get linked in with with either a financial counsellor or the tax connects to get additional advice, and place any enforcement on hold. It's also really important that they understand how this has happened, and they might be able to give you some information that you didn't know. The tax office knows everything. And if you're seeking information about a debt that's incurred in your name, then they might have some answers for you, which is important. So what you said before about, what is the tax office doing? There was an inquiry by the tax ombudsman a couple of years ago into how the tax office is responding to financial abuse tax debts. It was a big thing in a Senate inquiry as well recently, so they're definitely taking steps. As an advocate, I wish that it was moving a little bit faster than it is, but they are considering and they have accepted all the tax ombudsman recommendations. The family violence, it's just how to implement it. And I mean, it is a big ship. So it's good that they're taking their time and they're being very considered. But in the meantime, tax debts are still being incurred through financial abuse, and it's a big problem.
You walk straight into my next question there. So what policy changes would you like to say, as an advocate, what policy changes would you like to recommend to improve the protections and outcomes?
One policy change that I would love to see implemented as soon as possible is protections for victim survivors. So a specific option implemented through legislation. It needs to be a legislative change that would allow no-fault victim survivors. So being able to show that you didn't incur this debt, this wasn't you, and a consideration of safety issues around whether or not the debt can be then transferred to the perpetrator's name safely or not, and allowing victim survivors to not have to hold the consequences of somebody else's actions. That needs to be implemented in a way that's really easy to follow, that's procedural, and that is public, so victim survivors know that they have options.
Yeah, I think the really easy to follow, I think that's a really key point, because it's just so overwhelming. And when you're already experiencing financial abuse, which often occurs, with other forms of family violence, who has the time and energy and the headspace to go through with long-winded processes for this stuff? So it's really, that's a really good policy suggestion. So hopefully someone listens to that one. And how can agencies better collaborate to address the intersection of financial abuse and taxation?
I think agencies do so much. I think it's more just about issue spotting and knowing where to go for that extra support. I think that recognising that there are financial abuse tax debts and asking what's happening, checking with victim survivors if their taxes are up to date, and getting them linked in with the tax connects to get that support just means that, the earlier you can get in with the tax office, the better it'll be. But I also think another thing I'd recommend is really keeping an eye out for poor responses from the tax office. Asking your clients if they've disclosed the family violence to a tax officer, what was the response, was it acceptable, and whether or not it's worth making a complaint. I am a big fan of making complaints. I think that people should make complaints more.
Okay, we can take that on board. Thank you. Can you explain how GST fraud contributes to tax debt in the context of financial abuse?
Yes. So a few years ago, during COVID, there was a policy change from the government that required the tax office to refund GST claims within a very short period of time, which meant that essentially the tax office was sending tens of thousands of dollars to businesses very, very quickly without verifying any information perhaps that was being included in a small business GST refund, which meant that there was a lot of fraud. It's been in the news. It's billions of dollars. It's a massive problem. And a small subsection of that is that perpetrators use this system to incur tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollar debts in victim survivors' names. I've spoken with clients who had no idea that this is happening, that receiving the disability support pension, who were had an ABN from 5 or 6 years ago that was inactive, that they weren't using. Perpetrators had access to their MyGov.
Wow. Yeah.
They've never benefited from any of the money, and now they're owing debts that are increasing tenfold because the GIC, which is the general interest charge, cannot be remitted from a GST debt. These debts, as far as the information that we've received and the advice that we've received, aren't extinguished in bankruptcy because they're incurred by fraud. And so you've got very, very frightened people who are also the victim of fraud and the victim of this abuse are sitting there with debts that they don't know how to deal with. And the tax office has been grappling with this problem for a very long time, and we still are not sure how they're going to respond to individual circumstances. They don't necessarily have pathways available to them. It's been an incredibly difficult problem, and if people have GST fraud debts, then they need to call the National Debt Helpline, or they need to call their local tax clinic and get linked in for some advice as quickly as they can.
Yeah, that sounds like a good option. Well, that's all of our questions. So I just want to say thank you for coming to speak with us today about this very important topic. And it sounds like such a great service that both the National Debt Helpline and the Consumer Action Law Centre offer. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.